Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on HVSBL podcast. And today I'm joined by professors Alana, Vincent, and Vanden Eykel. So yeah, y'all got a book that's coming out. It's obviously not out yet, but it's on its way. And it's called Judeophobia and the New Testament. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about what aspects of Judeophobia that are y'all tackling? Specifically, is there anti-Semitism in the New Testament? Do you both see anti-Semitism in some parts of the New Testament?
Eric is one of the editors who did the big framing on that.
Mm-hmm.
You want to take the lead on this one?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think the conversation we had about the title is probably the best place to start with that. We initially had titled the book Judeophobia in the New Testament, and then we had a long, hard think about whether that should be in or and we changed it to and because we figured, that's actually a little bit more accurate. So the angle that we're after is that there's certainly some New Testament texts that contain what we can identify as Judeophobia and Judeophobic rhetoric, but then there's also some texts that maybe it's either absent or subtle, but those texts have been used to promote Judeophobia in the past and present. Yeah.
Probably also worth talking about the distinction between anti-Semitism and Judeophobia, because anti-Semitism is, as I'm sure we all know, a term that emerges really in a political context only in the late 19th century. And we historians like to be precise sometimes. It's a little bit difficult to say that texts that were written millennia before anti-Semitism was an operative concept are anti-Semitic as such. So by changing the language to Judeophobia, we can kind of say, well, it's not that they are anti-Semitic in the narrow technical sense, but there are definitely problems with the way these texts, either in their content or their history of reception, treat Judaism that are worth talking about.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
So, Alana, you cover a bit about Galatians. Is that right? You see how Paul gets into arguments with individuals like Cephas and potentially others. How would you describe Paul's rhetoric, or what Paul said, how Paul speaks against other Jews like Cephas that he's arguing against? And he seems to get really upset at the notion of circumcision.
Yeah, so one of the points that I make in that chapter, or that we make because I co-authored it with my long-term writing partner, Mark Godden, one of the points that we make is precisely that Paul's rhetoric in Galatians is really harsh. It is really black and white. He does this whole exercise in creating these binary contrasts where basically there's the good guys and the bad guys, and we're going to line everything up on one side or the other. And in the history of reception, that rhetorical styling has a lot of possibly unintended by Paul echoes, in which we keep ending up with this binary construction in which Christians good, therefore QED, Jews bad. Yeah. And that echoes through the reception that we see in the Church Fathers. We see that coming back in the Reformation, and especially in the Reformation.
Right. When Paul becomes a Protestant.
When Paul becomes a Protestant.
The bad guys become Jews. Right?
Yeah, Calvin's commentary on Galatians is really instructive in this way, because Calvin, unlike Luther, Calvin does not care about Jews at all, but he still needs his readers to understand that Jews are bad. They misunderstand the true word of God. So you understand that Jews misunderstand the true word of God? Yes? Got that clear in your mind? Great. Catholics.
Right.
Catholics are just like Jews.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
Right? Which is another way that the Judeophobic aspects of the text get reinscribed even when the target of the commentary isn't Jews.
So, Eric, which part of the New Testament do you cover in your contribution?
Yeah, so in my contribution, I actually don't cover anything in the New Testament. I cover another text called the Proto-Gospel of James. So we decided, in addition to chapters on all of the New Testament books, that we would also include non-canonical books that perhaps have particular kind of Judeophobic elements. And so we do the Gospel of Peter and the Epistle of Barnabas, and then I do the Proto-Gospel of James. So it's a sort of a post-New Testament text that is drawing from primarily Matthew, Luke, and John. But I argue in this book that or in my contribution, I argue that it is sort of caricaturing the Jewish characters in this story, and that the author's source for what Jews are like is the Gospels in the New Testament, which are already caricaturing Jews, or Jewish leaders. And so this author is sort of caricaturing a caricature, which in the end ends up being just kind of a little bit of a disaster. Yeah.
What kind of Judeophobia that do you encounter in the Gospel of James?
Well, so the argument that I make, sort of leaning into this idea of this sort of caricature of a caricature. First of all, caricatures are always harmful. They misrepresent people, and when those become the reality of, like, this is what people are actually like, then that's automatically bad. The argument that I make, though, in my contribution about the Proto-Gospel of James is that the caricatures of the Jewish leaders, for example, there's this episode in the Proto-Gospel where Mary, Jesus' mother, this is a text about the birth and childhood of Mary, and Mary is living in the temple. She goes to live in the temple when she's 3 years old, and when she turns 12, the priests in the temple become concerned about her. She's becoming a woman, and she's going to start bleeding, and they're concerned that she's going to defile the temple space. And if you are, and so there's this over concern, like a caricatured concern with ritual purity. And she's living in the temple, so obviously it's sort of which is a weird detail anyway. But what I argue, though, is that the reader of this text, who has been led to see Mary as utterly pure and really not capable of defiling anything, and so the consequence of this episode is that readers come to see the temple priests as ignorant of their own traditions, and they are so focused on purity and law observance that they miss the fact that they have this extraordinary person, the mother of the Messiah, living with them, and they kick her out because they're more concerned with ritual purity. So it almost sort of echoes the story in Matthew where Herod is sort of wants to kill Jesus, right? Like I have no room in my life for the Christ. I'm just going to go ahead and whatever. So the Jewish leaders in the Proto-Gospel sort of fall into the same boat.
I mean, it also does really echo the grace works divide that Paul is constructing.
Absolutely.
As well.
Yeah, for sure.
So you both see some commonalities, as you just said, between you just mentioned Paul and you were just talking about the Gospel of James. So are there commonalities between how they both are framing the Jews in their different stories and narratives?
That's an interesting question, since I am not a New Testament Apocrypha person. I don't know your text at all.
Well, so why don't you talk about, I'm not telling you what to talk about, but why don't maybe you can take the Galatians part and I'll think about a clever answer for the Proto-Gospel part.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So, Paul does have this whole salvation through grace, not through the law thing he constructs in Galatians. It's kind of his thing. And if we're going to attempt to historicize this, obviously he is having an intra-Christian conflict, not intra-Jewish conflict. All right, the Galatians are not a mixed Jewish-Gentile Jesus community. They're a Gentile community.
Right.
And Paul is ticked off that the Galatians have gotten the gospel from him and then listened to other missionaries who are coming from a more Jewish community and starting to get these ideas that maybe maybe particular Jewish ritual commandments, circumcision's a big one. Circumcision's really the main one in Galatians.
Right. Or at least it's a symbol of all the other ones, at least. Yes.
Yeah. Maybe these should be part of their Christian practice. And Paul really, really wants to reject that. Partly because I think he would prefer that they just listen to his recitation of the gospel. There's that power struggle thing going on there. But his way of shoring up his position is to do a really forceful, wholesale rejection of anything remotely Jewish and particularistic.
Well, and he uses a sort of paradigmatic, important story of Abraham to make that case, right? Kinda.
Yeah. Because I come to this as less a biblical scholar per se, and much more a 20th century use of the Bible, particularly in interreligious issues scholar. That is the thing in Galatians and its reception that I have always found really weird and struggled with, because Paul, of all people, should know that the Abrahamic covenant is not actually the important one in terms of Jewish religious life, right?
But do you think he's changing the game a little bit?
I think he is changing the game there, and by focusing precisely by making circumcision the symbol of everything else, he can reduce Jewish religious life to the symbol and the promise, and do his whole, you can have the promise without the symbol because you have Jesus. Where I think dealing with the full complexity of the Mosaic covenant does get you a little bit in the weeds on, okay, so theft. Are we still against theft? Or does Christ redeem us from property law? Right. It's a lot harder to just swipe away this massive, complex code that includes both ritual and purity and civil obligations. So, and I think that move goes into the reception history, becomes Augustine's division between ceremonial and moral law that echoes down through the centuries. And we obviously the moral law is important. I mean, no one's saying anything against the moral law.
Right.
What exactly is the moral law? Well, that depends on which bits we want to pay attention to today. Yeah. But so again, Jews and Judaism are figured in Galatians as really hyperfixated on the actually meaningless material practice, represented by circumcision in that particular case. But I think it does also have echoes of temple temple practices, purity codes, kashrut, etc., etc.
Right.
Yeah. Have you come up with a clever answer yet?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah,
great.
I've changed it a couple times. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. So the answer that I have is sort of thinking about this in terms of Galatians and what you just said about Galatians. Definitely an intra sort of Christ devotion conversation going on, and potentially either focusing on idiosyncratic things or just sort of reframing what he considers, what he thinks his readers need to understand about Judaism. The proto-gospel sort of, it's interesting because every character in the story, for the most part, is Jewish. And so it's very much in that story, it's not, with Galatians, it's sort of Paul's teaching versus the teaching of the traditionally called the Judaizers, right? We don't need to discuss whether that's a good, but traditionally this is that kind of label of those who want to sort of encourage that congregation to be, or the group to be more Jewish. And so in the proto-gospel, though, you don't have the sort of Jesus devotion versus Judaism. You have sort of the Jews who are the Jewish characters who are sort of in support of Mary and her child, and then the Jewish leaders who aren't. And so it's sort of framed as kind of an intra-Jewish dichotomy, but also this is by an author who is, there's some argument about, how do we categorize the religious views of this author? And there's some who study this text who say, oh, it's definitely a Jewish author. I frankly disagree with that. I think this author's knowledge of Judaism is very, very kind of pedestrian. And but I think it's interesting that they sort of, those two texts, they frame the debate as or the tension between very different groups, right? Yeah.
I want to ask you a follow-up, but I think it's going to take us way down a rabbit hole. Nevertheless.
Okay.
How are you judging the author's knowledge of Judaism as very, very pedestrian? Because I actually would say the same thing about Paul's presentation of Judaism. Right, he is deliberately editing out stuff that we know from his biography.
Right.
He knows. So if we had only the Pauline texts,
right? Yeah.
I would not connect the author of those texts to any of the rabbinic schools that I find recorded in Talmud.
Yeah. So, and I think that's, sort of going back to the caricature of a caricature, this author is clearly familiar with the Gospels, but the author, there's a paper out there that needs to be written about this author's knowledge of Paul, which I think this author does know the Pauline letters, or at least some of them. And so I think it's entirely possible that this author's views on what Judaism is, I think those are very much based on New Testament texts like Paul, maybe some Septuagintal texts. But, one example is like the test of the ordeal of the bitter waters, the sotah in the proto-gospel, where it doesn't really follow what's actually in the Hebrew Bible, because Joseph and Mary both drink the bitter waters. Which doesn't make any sense, because Joseph is it's supposed to be a test of fidelity for the woman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, nothing about that makes any sense. This is amazing.
Right,
I am going to spend time with the proto-gospel now.
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, it's a stitch, and that's one of those that's one of those scenes that's been really confusing people. Like, why does this author have Joseph taking on this test as well as Mary? It's like, because this author doesn't really understand what that test actually is doing, or he's doing something else.
Don't we have some medieval traditions that actually feminize Joseph in some weird way? So, yeah.
I mean, I say, oh yeah, as I'm sure there are texts like that. I haven't done any deep dives into them, but I think one of the seeds for sort of quote unquote feminizing Joseph would be in the proto-gospel, which is a hugely influential text throughout the medieval period. And one of the things that characterizes Joseph in this text is that he has no interest at all in being married to Mary. Like, when the priests are like, you need to get married, you need to take the virgin of the Lord. And his response is like, this is embarrassing. I'm an old man, and she's 12. And I don't want anything to do with this. And then when he gets home, he's like, you stay here. I'm going to build houses. Like, he has no interest whatsoever in her. And so I suppose that could actually be sort of, that could very well sort of turn into, like, Joseph is this kind of like emasculated, like, asexual something or whatever. There's sort of complicated categories there, but
Jacob, please ask us a question before we keep going with this, because we are going way outside either of our expertise.
So you both ended up finding some commonality between the Judeophobia of Paul in Galatians and also the author of the Proto-Evangelium of James. What are you both attempting to show when y'all write this stuff respectively? What are y'all trying to show readers regarding the Judeophobia in the New Testament?
Now, texts have a lot of different lives. There's the circumstances in which they were written, there's the circumstances in which they've been interpreted historically, there's what we do with them now. I think it's useful and important, especially with big, significant, shaping people's lives texts, like the Bible.
Or Galatians, which turns out has been an important text for the history of Christianity.
Just a little bit. I think it's important to regularly go through the exercise of thinking about how texts have shifted in their use and the way we make meaning from them over time, and remind ourselves that, on the one hand, texts are, they're fixed in a certain way, but interpretation is also a choice. One of the reason I wanted to write the Galatians chapter in particular is that my very first job after my PhD, my first postdoc, was as the Barbara Osher Research Fellow in memory of Christer Stendahl at the Swedish Theological Institute in Jerusalem. So we did Jewish-Christian dialogue stuff, but very much with attention to the legacy of Stendhal, who thought a lot about Galatians.
To put it mildly.
I think, like, almost a good solid third of my chapter is talking specifically about Stendhal and what he was trying to do and where he actually fell a bit short. He wanted to rescue Paul, and especially the Paul of Galatians, from what he considered a history of misinterpretation that inscribed Judeophobic readings on top of the pure Pauline text. And his great line that I quote in the chapter is, we should understand what Paul is saying about the law, not as a rejection of Jewish practice per se. He's not saying Jews are bad. He's just saying that the law is bad for Christians. The law is like the harsh babysitter that God gave to the Jews to make sure that they didn't go and raid the refrigerator before the Gentiles were able to turn up at the great banquet of salvation that everyone's supposed to enjoy together. And that sounds great, except that then you remember that there are still Jews in the world. And what are you saying about the nerdy kids who are still wanting to hang out with the babysitter after the party has already started? What are we really saying here? A lot of 20th century liberalizing reinterpretation of Paul, attempting to challenge the longer history of much more overtly Judeophobic interpretations, is doing that kind of thing. It's correcting the most obvious hostility in the interpretive tradition, but also still reinscribing very uncritically assumptions about Christian universalism and superiority that I think still bear thinking about a little bit harder.
Yeah.
So that's,
Yeah, and I think for my purposes and in my scholarship, I deal mostly with narrative texts and not Pauline texts, or letters or whatever. But my function, I think, in this book, or my purpose, is to sort of help people to see how the details of narratives can be used and interpreted, and sometimes in ways that the author didn't intend. So I think the author of the Proto-Gospel, does this author believe that they are criticizing Judaism? I actually am not sure that they do. I think that they actually. They're doing a few different things, but I don't think that they are necessarily meaning to do the sorts of things that they do through their narrative. But that's one of those things. It's like, so that sometimes we sometimes our texts, sometimes our words end up meaning things that we didn't intend, but those are still legitimate construals of meaning. So yeah, that's my goal is to sort of see how those narrative details, even the really, really subtle ones, kind of contribute to that broader portrait as well.
Alana, have you seen Galatians get interpreted in the wrong way, in the way that Paul did not intend, like what the kind of thing that Eric was just talking about?
Well, I think Eric and I might have a slight methodological difference here, because I am really much more firmly in the reader response. We don't access the mind of the author.
Fully on the same page there. Yes.
Yeah.
We can offer educated guesses, and we can offer hypotheses.
I don't think I would ever want to say something about Paul's intent. I can say what it looks to me like Paul is trying to do with that text, but that's an educated guess. Right. And coming from that, I'm also not a super big fan of right and wrong interpretation because reading a text is a conversation between the fixity of the page and the context of the reader. And what questions do you have when you read the text? What are you trying to do with it? There are, I think, interpretations that may be closer or further away to the original context of the text, which I'm not sure is itself a super helpful question to be asking, since we ourselves are very far away from the original context of the text. Mostly I'm focused on interpretive moves that are more or less helpful to particular circumstances. And what I'm interested in, coming from the world of Jewish-Christian dialogue, is, are these interpretations actually helping us to think about a world in which we live with other people who are not like us and do not share our religious presuppositions? And there, actually one of the most common favorite, frequently cited passages in Galatians, I find one of the most problematic. In Christ Jesus, there's no male or female, slave or free, Jew or Greek.
Yeah. Horrifying, right? Like, no more diversity.
Well,
yeah.
Right, you see that.
Right.
But I have worked my entire career in departments of, mixed theology and religious studies departments, working very often with very sincerely committed liberal Christians who think that this passage is a vision of the kingdom where everyone just becomes equal, and this is what we should aspire to. And I keep having to be the difficult person saying, okay, that's nice for you. What about me?
Right. Well,
you seem to think that we're all one in Christ Jesus means that if the staff Christmas lunch has only ham, I shouldn't have a problem eating it, to use a very concrete example.
Exactly, yeah.
That's right. That's universalism through dissolution of particular identities. And the other word we have for when that's done historically in, say, dealings with indigenous communities, is genocide.
Right. Exactly.
So
well, and that's the thing. I mean, it's not always the case, but when people are saying, oh no, I believe that we're all one in wherever, like, well, I mean, through Jesus or not, generally speaking, when somebody says, I don't see any of these differentiations anymore, that person is also often considering their own particularity to be the norm.
Correct.
So, we're going to be, we don't have to worry about differences anymore because we're all going to be like me, which is not helpful.
Yeah. So yes, if we're looking for an interpretation of Galatians that, even though I recognize the context from which it comes and what it is trying to do, I think is actually deeply unhelpful. The closest thing I will go to saying wrong, that's it. Yeah.
And I think we actually have a lot more common ground in terms of just kind of interpretive moves. I mean, I very strongly think that the meaning of the author, absolutely 100%, we cannot know that meaning with any certainty. But I think that sort of offering hypotheses about that meaning sets some helpful parameters.
Oh yeah.
But then also the reader, what readers do with these texts, like that's real. If somebody sends me an email that I read and I say, this is like, this person's being a jerk, and throws me into like a rage for 2 or 3 days. Hypothetically, of course.
Not that this ever happens.
I never get emails like this ever.
No, of course not.
But then I talk to that person and I say, I really thought your email was bad or whatever for these reasons, and then they say, "Oh my God, I definitely didn't mean it that way." Well, that sort of helps because I can identify the authorial intent there. However, the meaning that I pulled from that is still a legitimate construal of meaning. And so those things, we have to be able to hold those together to say, even though you didn't necessarily mean to be a jerk, you still came across as
a jerk.
Yeah, so,
and maybe...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, please.
Well, my final question to you both, what do you both hope for readers to take away from all this?
Well, this is pitched largely as a teaching volume. We have discussion questions and some, classroom activities at the end of every single chapter. So, I think the big goal here is to give students and their teachers a good way of engaging with some of the questions about these texts and their history of interpretation that at this point, I think most people understand that these questions exist, and there should be a way of discussing them in a sensitive and informed way when we're looking at New Testament studies in the classroom.
Yeah. And I would say, and this is one of the 3 editors' opinions, so Meredith and Sarah, if you're watching, I hope I'm doing a good job of articulating this. But one of the things that I found as I've read through this book, in editing a book like this, you have to read through it several times. So I think I just read through it the 5th time. And one of the things that's kind of has started to stand out to me is that, yes, we designed it for classroom use, primarily undergraduate, but we're also hoping for some seminary use. And but as I've been reading through it, I've sort of come to realize that this is a guide for students, but ideally, we're really hoping that the instructors, the professors, academics, whoever, when they're reading this, there should be at least one moment where you sort of see something and you go, "Oh, I do that." And it's sort of a I'm thinking about Sarah Parks has a wonderful chapter on Judeophobia in feminist Jesus scholarship, and it, as it turns out, so this is good, important, well-meaning scholarship that also presents Jesus as, well, Jesus, look at Jesus, he had women, and also Jews of that era were not friendly to women or whatever, which is like, and she points out here that this trope, the way that people, and obviously feminist scholars aren't framing it that way, but that's the consequence of, or some of them are. Some
feminist scholars are basically doing the John Calvin move.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And as someone with, a lot of feet in the world of feminist scholarship, some feminist scholars will say, well, I don't think I need to be responsible for that history because I'm trying to have I'm trying to say something even more important than that. And Sarah does a great job in that chapter.
It's a great chapter, I think that I imagine, professors in the classroom reading this text along with their students and also kind of realizing where in their own rhetoric this toxic stuff comes out. And often it comes out in ways that we definitely didn't intend, and so there's things that people say, anti-Jewish things that people say, and they're not aware. I mean, the great example of this is when Christians today talk about, so-and-so is a Pharisee, right? Okay, well, what they're doing there is they're basing this off of this sort of, caricature of Pharisees in the Gospels, and they haven't been shown like this is actually the Pharisees historically aren't hypocrites as they're represented and as the English dictionaries define them as today. Yeah. If you look in the Pharisee hypocrite, well, this is really, really, really problematic. And so there are good, well-meaning people out there who are using this rhetoric without knowing the baggage that it travels with. Yeah. And once you sort of show them, then the expectation is that we say, oh, I didn't realize I was doing that. I'm sorry. I'm going to do better. And we're hoping that book has that effect as well.
That would be nice.
Yeah. It's good. In a perfect world. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, thank you, Eric, Vanden Eykel, and thank you, Alana Vincent, for joining me today.
Yeah.
Pleasure.
Happy to be here.
Yeah.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.